So I'm going to speak today about Hillsborough Castle, which is a landed estate in County Down in Northern Ireland. This site has served multiple roles throughout its history. So originally it was the landed estate and family home of the Hill family, before it then became the residence of the Governor of Northern Ireland. Today it also operates as the royal residence for the British royal family, as well as the official residence of the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, while also functioning as a public heritage site managed by historic royal palaces. But today I'm going to focus on the period from 1925 to 1972, when Hillsborough Castle acted as the official residence of the Governor of Northern Ireland, during which time it was renamed Government House to fit with this new use. Just a little context on the governorship then. The office of governor was established following the partition of Ireland, and it was created to represent the British monarch in the newly formed state. And although ceremonial, the role did carry significant symbolic and social weight, and support for the governorship did tend to follow the traditional political lines in Ireland. So the Unionist and Protestant communities, who were in the majority in the new state and who typically identified as British, they embraced the position of governor as a marker of British connection and royal legitimacy, while the nationalist and Catholic communities, who typically identified as Irish, opposed this office as an emblem of partition and of British dominance within the new state. And between 1922 to 1972, while the position of governor existed, 5 men served in the role, all of whom were married. And while these women held no formal role within the governorship itself, they did assume an unofficial role of wife to the governor. And my research explores these unofficial roles and the influence they could exert through these, including within the domestic and ceremonial spaces of Hillsborough Castle. And a central theme of this research is the way that these women help shape the public identity and social circles of the governorship through their control of guest lists and management of hospitality at Hillsborough Castle, which allowed them to decide and dictate not only who was included in these networks, but just as importantly, who was not. So I'm going to focus on these entertaining practices in my paper, and I'll focus in particular on how they use the spaces of the castle to sustain elite and landed networks, particularly from the 1920s to the 1940s, how these activities helped construct a Unionist identity within the new state of Northern Ireland, and then how this allowed Hillsborough Castle itself to play an active role in shaping identities. And just to say that I will draw on 2 of the 5 governors' wives in particular. So firstly, it'll be the wife of the first governor, who was Rosalind Abercorn, or the 3rd Duchess of Abercorn, and her husband was governor from 1922 to 1945. So she came from the landed class, so she was already closely connected to Britain and Ireland's social and political elites, and was very much part of these landed networks. And then also the wife of the 2nd governor, who was Countess Rose Granville, and her husband was governor from 1945 to 1952. So she was sister of the Queen Mother and aunt to Queen Elizabeth II. So she also came from very elite social circles as well. So in terms of the social season then at Hillsborough Castle, the castle had long served as an entertaining space under the Hill family during its time as a landed estate, and had regularly hosted members of the landed class. And when it became Government House, this tradition did continue, but took on a new character, shaped by the site's royal connections. And Hillsborough Castle during this time was therefore more than just a private family home for the governor, because it became the centre of official entertaining for the governorship, and it was described by the Northern Whig as Northern Ireland's viceregal court. And the intense social calendar of the governorship also became a recognised feature of public life. So a local newspaper, the Belfast Newsletter, for example, regularly published schedules of upcoming events in the court and society or court and personal columns, and these were placed alongside updates and the movements of the British royal family themselves. And as the first residence of Hillsborough Castle in its new role as Government House, the Duke and Duchess of Abercorn played a particularly important role in establishing and then shaping this social season for the governorship. And in the early years then of Northern Ireland under the Abercorns, social events at Hillsborough Castle did come to be particularly significant because the castle did have the opportunity to serve as a key stage for constructing and reflecting social and political hierarchies within the formative years of the new state. And guest lists were central to this and functioned as tools of soft power, allowing the Duchess of Abercorn in particular to shape who was recognised as part of the social circles connected to the governorship. And their inclusion on these guest lists then offered these figures a place at the apex of social life within the new state due to the site's royal identity, which then conferred a sense of exclusivity and privilege. This was particularly evident through the dinner parties, which were hosted at Hillsborough Castle, and they became the most prominent form of entertaining under the Duchess. So these were very elaborate affairs with 6 or 7 course meals served in the formal dining room, and they were typically attended by no more than 30 guests. And invitations to these were based primarily on social status, with guests drawn from the Unionist elites and the landed class, whom the Abercorns had long socialised with because of their own landed background. And surviving guest lists from the 1920s and 1930s do reveal this recurring pattern and dominance by prominent Unionist families, with some of the main ones listed on screen. And some of these figures did also hold some positions within the new state. So Viscount Brookborough, for example, would later become the 3rd Prime Minister of Northern Ireland in 1943. But what was significant about these guest lists was that although some of these figures did remain visible in the new state by holding some of these positions, and were then given a place in the elite social world of Northern Ireland through their involvement with entertaining practices at the castle, the status and power of the broader landed class was already in decline. And so entertaining at Hillsborough Castle did form part of a wider effort to sustain elite traditions and to preserve the social status of this class within the evolving political landscape of Northern Ireland. The Duchess of Abercorn's efforts then to preserve the traditions and connections with the landed class were also evident in the way that she positioned Hillsborough Castle's social season in relation to the wider British and Irish social seasons. So while the Anglo-Irish season had typically run from February to March, and then the London season from May to July, the main events at Hillsborough Castle were usually scheduled between March and April, and then again from August to October. And this careful timing was done to avoid clashes with the other elite social seasons and ensure that the remnants of Northern Ireland's landed class, many of whom still maintained houses or social ties in Britain and the south of Ireland, to ensure that they could fully participate in the social events of the governorship. And this also showed the Duchess of Abercorn's wider personal connections with the landed class, and also her desire to ensure that the governorship was at the very centre of this elite social world. Dinner parties then at Hillsborough Castle were often followed by larger dances or evening receptions, to which additional guests were then invited. And the continued presence of the landed class in Northern Ireland was also evident at these events, as the Duchess of Abercorn frequently consulted with other elite women for the names of young women to invite to these, and they were typically drawn from the same landed and socially prominent families. And the inclusion of these young women also pointed to the continued practice of social patronage, whereby elite daughters were introduced into social and political life through their presence at these events, which also further reinforced the importance of gatherings and entertainment at Hillsborough Castle for social networking opportunities within the new state. But invitations to some of these larger social events, like the dances at Hillsborough Castle, were also occasionally extended to Catholic and nationalist guests, including nationalist MPs and members of the Catholic clergy, but they chose not to attend. And the Catholic Church, for example, explicitly boycotted events in protest against the Catholic discrimination in the new state of Northern Ireland, stating that they felt morally bound to refuse such invitations. But these boycotts did then inadvertently allow the entertaining practices at the castle to become increasingly and almost exclusively dominated by Unionist figures. And in this way, the social world of Hillsborough Castle did come to reflect the broader tensions and divisions surrounding identity within Northern Ireland. But the Duchess of Abercorn was therefore able to shape entertaining practices at Hillsborough Castle around a very narrow and a very elite social circle. Elite and exclusive entertaining also continued then under Countess Rose Granville, the wife of the second governor. So her time at Hillsborough Castle was marked by an increase in royal visits, reflecting both her family background as well as her social standing. And a sister of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, and at the time the future aunt to Queen Elizabeth II, Countess Granville was uniquely positioned to host senior royals in a way that blurred the boundaries between more official state business and more private family gatherings. So while royal visits under the Abercorns had been more formal and ceremonial, under Countess Granville they did take on a more personal and informal character. So these occasions often involved time spent in the gardens of the castle, informal dining with the Granvilles, or just enjoying the relative privacy of the Hillsborough estate. And Countess Granville, therefore, did play a central role in consolidating the royal identity of Hillsborough Castle and in further elevating its status as a royal residence within Northern Ireland. Hillsborough Castle did also come to become a key site for more sort of politically focused events. And the Duchess of Abercorn, for example, introduced parliamentary dinner parties into the castle's social calendar. So for these, she issued invitations to around 50 leading ministers and their spouses, most of them, again, Unionist figures because they dominated government at this time. And these dinners offered her husband, but also herself, an opportunity to engage directly with Northern Ireland's political leadership, but within a more informal setting. And again, although a small number of invitations were extended to nationalist government figures for these events, they were boycotted or just simply ignored. On her arrival then, Countess Granville adapted these parliamentary dinner parties and introduced what she called sherry parties. These gatherings were less formal but were larger in scale. So she replaced the seated dinner with buffet suppers and extended the guest lists to between 300 to 350 individuals, drawn not only from political circles but also from the elite social circles that she and her husband moved in. But despite these slight stylistic differences, both these women used the events in an attempt to sustain but also project Unionist dominance within Northern Ireland's political and social life, but under the guise of social entertainment. However, the Unionist dominance and identity constructed at Hillsborough Castle by the governor's wives did not go unchallenged. It was criticised and it was resisted by those excluded from its narratives, which again did reflect the wider tensions and divisions surrounding identity within the new Northern Irish state. And this was evident because the more politically focused functions of Hillsborough Castle did draw criticism, and it was Countess Granville's sherry parties which were singled out by the Irish Examiner as blurring the line between the more ceremonial hospitality, which had maybe come to be expected of the governorship, and this more obvious political activity. And so the castle did come to be viewed as quite a contested space throughout 20th century Northern Ireland, and as both socially and politically exclusive throughout the governorship. Other criticisms were also directed against the entertaining practices at the castle more generally, notably against the exclusive nature of guest lists and their dominance by the landed class that I've mentioned. And as one nationalist MP remarked, nobody ever goes there, Government House, except parliamentary secretaries and gentlemen seeking jobs. Objections were also raised against the symbolism and the cost of the site itself, and nationalist MPs and nationalist-leaning newspapers regularly questioned the public funds devoted to maintaining such a residence, particularly in a new state with limited resources. And as one nationalist MP complained, with the quote on screen, £10,000 in expenses is to be devoted almost exclusively to entertainment, highfalutin parties, and that sort of thing in a community of little more than 1 million people, which he claimed was reckless expenditure on an unnecessary luxury. Tensions surrounding Hillsborough Castle also became increasingly visible in the later years of the governorship, as the castle emerged as a key site for protests among the minority Catholic and nationalist communities, and this was over their treatment and discrimination under the majority Unionist government, while petitions were also sent to the castle in protest of this treatment. And again, I think this highlights the castle as a contested space, but also emphasise alternative versions of Northern Irish identity, which had been largely excluded from the social and political networks within the formative years, and which had also been largely excluded from the spaces of Hillsborough Castle. So, just to conclude then, you're a step ahead of me. I do think Hillsborough Castle offers quite an interesting case study within the history of Northern Ireland, because particularly the entertaining spaces became an extension of Unionist efforts to construct and project a specifically British and Protestant identity, particularly within the early years of the new state. So the castle did come to symbolise then not only the union with Britain, but also attempts by the Unionist elite and the landed class to assert a cultural and political dominance within Northern Ireland. And the elite and Unionist identity did continue to be evident under the next 3 governors and their wives, right up until the governorship was abolished in 1972, following the introduction of direct rule to Northern Ireland. And the Unionist identity continued to be evident in 1958, for example, when the daughter of the Marchioness of Dufferin and Ava, another prominent landed family in Northern Ireland, when she remarked at a ball hosted by the 3rd governor and his wife, who were Lord and Lady Wakehurst, that it was the best thing that has happened since the Battle of the Boyne. And Lady Wakehurst herself later reflected that this remark was typical of the way they, people in Northern Ireland, related everything back to historical events and politics. And I do think this moment captures how social life at Hillsborough Castle did operate within this broader culture of historical referencing, and how it was very much centred on an identity rooted in Unionist heritage and British tradition. But as I've also tried to show, this identity was contested, it was very selective, and it was also resisted by those excluded from its narratives, particularly the minority Catholic and nationalist communities who boycotted events at Hillsborough Castle and who rejected the exclusive identity that was projected within these spaces. So although Hillsborough Castle no longer functioned as a traditional landed estate, as it had done under the Hill family, how it was used, particularly by the Duke, but more so the Duchess of Abercorn, very much allowed it to continue to serve many of the same roles, as it became a key site for the social entertaining and networking of the landed class in Northern Ireland. And so for the governor's wives, I would say entertaining at Hillsborough Castle was therefore not simply about hospitality, it was about using these domestic spaces to create an image of authority, continuity, and of a very specific identity within a deeply divided state. So, thank you.